Anxiety does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper that refuses to leave. A quiet pressure behind your ribs. A tightening in your throat before the day has even begun. A restless current moving through your thoughts while the world around you still looks ordinary and calm. You wake up already negotiating with invisible fears. You imagine conversations that have not happened. You rehearse disasters that may never come. You carry the weight of outcomes that do not yet exist, and somehow your body responds as though the danger is already at the door. This is what makes anxiety so exhausting. It does not always destroy your life in obvious ways. More often, it drains your power slowly, invisibly, until hesitation begins to feel natural and fear begins to sound like wisdom. The Stoics understood something that modern people often forget. You do not suffer only because life is difficult. You suffer because your mind keeps trying to control what was never yours to control. Anxiety feeds on that confusion. It grows in the space between what is happening and what you demand must happen. It expands every time you treat uncertainty like a personal threat. It becomes stronger when you believe peace will come only after the world becomes predictable, after people behave the way you want, after outcomes align with your plans, after the future finally agrees to reveal itself on your terms. But life does not work that way. And the more you demand certainty from a world built on change, the more anxious your inner life becomes. This is why anxiety feels so humiliating to so many people. Not only because it hurts, but because it makes you feel small in your own mind. You know the thoughts are excessive, yet they keep circling. You know the fear is disproportionate, yet your body still obeys it. You know you are imagining tomorrow while standing in today, yet your nervous system keeps racing as though imagination were reality. Anxiety creates a fracture between what you understand and what you feel. And in that fracture, your sense of power begins to leak away. You stop trusting your own judgment. You stop moving with clarity. You begin to live defensively, reacting to possibilities instead of responding to life as it actually is. The Stoic path begins with a hard truth that feels almost offensive when anxiety is strong. Much of your distress does not come from events themselves, but from the meaning you attach to them. That does not mean your pain is fake. It means your suffering is being amplified by interpretation. A delayed message becomes rejection. A challenge becomes catastrophe. A mistake becomes evidence of permanent inadequacy. An uncertain future becomes a mental prison you keep walking through before you have even arrived there. Stoicism does not ask you to deny pain. It asks you to see how much of your fear is made heavier by the stories your mind is telling. And once you begin seeing that clearly, anxiety loses one of its greatest sources of power: unconscious exaggeration. The first principle of conquering anxiety is learning the difference between what you control and what you do not. This sounds simple until life presses directly on your fears. You do not control whether people approve of you. You do not control whether opportunities appear at the exact time you want. You do not control the economy, the weather, the opinions of others, the pace of change, the possibility of loss, or the fact that uncertainty exists. But you do control the way you meet these things. You control whether you let uncertainty become obsession. You control whether you let fear become identity. You control whether your inner life becomes a servant to events or a disciplined witness to them. Anxiety grows wild when these categories are blurred. The mind starts reaching toward outcomes it cannot command, and every failed attempt to command them creates more fear. This is why the Stoic distinction is not abstract philosophy. It is psychological medicine. The moment you stop trying to control what belongs to life and begin focusing on what belongs to your character, your energy changes direction. You are no longer scattering yourself across 10 imagined futures. You are returning to the only place power has ever truly lived: your judgment, your discipline, your choices, your response. This does not solve everything overnight, but it stops anxiety from feeding on impossible demands. The second principle is acceptance, and this is where many people resist the Stoic path most fiercely. Because acceptance sounds passive to the anxious mind. It sounds like surrender, weakness, resignation. But Stoic acceptance is none of those things. It is not giving up on life. It is giving up the fantasy that reality must obey your preferences before you can be at peace. Acceptance means looking at the situation in front of you without adding drama, resistance, and self-torment on top of it. It means saying, "This is what is here now, and I will meet it clearly." That single move restores enormous power because anxiety thrives where reality is denied and fights where life has already spoken. Think about how much suffering is created by arguing with what already is. You do not want the loss, the uncertainty, the delay, the rejection, the unanswered question, the vulnerable conversation, the risk you must take without guarantees. So the mind resists, and resistance becomes agitation. Agitation becomes rumination. Rumination becomes anxiety. The Stoic does something different. The Stoic faces the fact first. Not with numbness, but with honesty. This happened. This may happen. This is uncertain. This is difficult. This is not what I wanted. And yet, here it is. Acceptance does not remove pain, but it removes the wasteful inner war that multiplies pain into suffering. The third principle is mastering interpretation. Anxiety often begins long before anything truly dangerous occurs because the mind has learned to dramatize possibility. It imagines one failure and sees a ruined future. It imagines one rejection and sees permanent loneliness. It imagines one mistake and sees humiliation without end. Stoicism teaches you to interrupt that chain, not by lying to yourself, but by questioning the authority of your first reaction. Is this thought true, or only vivid? Is this fear a fact, or a projection? Is this event actually unbearable, or has your mind decorated it with layers of catastrophe? The anxious mind is not always irrational in content, but it is often irrational in scale. This matters because you live according to what your mind keeps rehearsing. If it keeps rehearsing collapse, your body begins preparing for collapse. If it keeps predicting humiliation, your energy begins shrinking in advance. If it keeps treating uncertainty as danger, you begin avoiding life in the name of protection. Stoicism teaches you to become suspicious of your own internal exaggeration. Not cynical, not detached, but disciplined. To look at the event with proportion. To ask what is actually known. To refuse the impulse to turn every challenge into prophecy. This is how you begin reclaiming space inside yourself. The fourth principle is the practice of negative visualization, and this is one of the most misunderstood Stoic tools. People hear it and assume it will make anxiety worse. But the Stoic does not visualize loss in order to become consumed by it. The Stoic does it to break fear's spell. Anxiety often survives by keeping feared outcomes vague, looming, and inflated. The mind says, "What if everything falls apart?" And because the image is shapeless, it feels infinite. Stoicism asks you to face the feared possibility directly and calmly. What if this does happen? What if the outcome is disappointing? What if the person leaves? What if the plan fails? What if I lose what I hoped to keep? Could I still endure, adapt, rebuild, and remain myself? That question is revolutionary because it reveals something anxiety works very hard to hide from you: your own capacity. Fear wants you to believe that if the bad thing happens, you end. The Stoic reminds you that this is rarely true. You may grieve. You may suffer. You may be changed. But you do not vanish. You do not become nothing. Human beings have survived losses, failures, betrayals, poverty, illness, exile, humiliation, and uncertainty far greater than the scenarios most anxious minds endlessly rehearse. Negative visualization does not weaken you. It introduces you to your own resilience. It reminds you that fear has been exaggerating your fragility. The fifth principle is returning to the present moment. Anxiety is rarely content with where you are. It wants to drag you into tomorrow, next month, next year, into imagined conversations, imagined disasters, imagined consequences. It does not want you standing where your feet actually are. Because here, in the present, life is often smaller than the mind's performance of it. Here, the breath is available. Here, the next step is visible. Here, you can wash the cup, answer the email, take the walk, make the call, sit with the discomfort, finish the task, speak the truth, or simply remain still. But anxiety wants to replace the next step with the entire staircase. And that is why it becomes so paralyzing. The Stoic refuses that mental excess. The Stoic returns to what is in front of them. Not forever, not abstractly, but now. What is the task? What is the fact? What is required in this moment? What is mine to do before the next hour arrives? This return to the present is not a cliché. It is a discipline of power. Every time you come back from imagined futures to the concrete reality of now, you reclaim energy that anxiety had stolen. You stop offering your nervous system to fantasies of disaster and begin anchoring it in action, breath, attention, and proportion. The sixth principle is disciplined action. Anxiety often creates the illusion that safety lies in delay. Think more. Wait longer. Check again. Rehearse another outcome. Avoid the conversation. Postpone the decision. Stay in preparation just a little longer. But delay feeds anxiety because every avoided action confirms to the mind that the feared thing must indeed be dangerous. Stoicism does not teach reckless action. It teaches purposeful action. The kind that says, I may feel fear, but I will still do what reason requires. I may feel uncertainty, but I will still move with character. I may not control the result, but I can control whether I meet life with cowardice or courage. This is where power begins returning in a very practical way. Not when you stop feeling anxiety completely, but when anxiety stops deciding your behavior. When you make the call anyway, speak anyway, apply anyway, leave anyway, begin anyway, rest anyway, tell the truth anyway, stop explaining anyway, set the boundary anyway. That is not theatrical bravery. It is Stoic bravery, the quiet refusal to let internal weather become a tyrant over your choices. And every time you act from reason instead of fear, your mind learns a new lesson. Anxiety is a sensation, not a master. The seventh principle is inner observation. The Stoics were relentless students of the self. They knew that the undisciplined mind creates its own suffering and then blames the world for the consequences. So they watched themselves. They observed impulses, reactions, assumptions, resentments, fears, and desires with a clarity that most people avoid. This matters deeply for anxiety because much of anxiety survives in automaticity. The thought appears, and you obey. The fear rises, and you identify with it. The sensation comes, and you assume it means something catastrophic. Observation interrupts this chain. It allows you to say, there is fear, there is tension, there is the urge to catastrophize, there is the old habit of overreaching into tomorrow. And because you can see it, you are no longer fully possessed by it. Journaling, reflection, silence, and deliberate self-examination all become part of reclaiming your power here. Not because they are trendy, but because they create distance between you and your mental machinery. They allow you to see patterns that anxiety would rather keep hidden. The situations that trigger you most. The stories you repeat most. The outcomes you fear most. The places where your need for certainty becomes unreasonable. The conditions under which your mind begins surrendering its balance. Once these patterns become visible, they become workable. And what is workable is far less terrifying than what remains vague and unexamined. There is another truth the Stoics would insist upon. Anxiety is often tied to misplaced value. You become anxious not only because something may happen, but because you have decided that your peace depends on a particular outcome. You need the relationship to survive. You need the project to succeed. You need the approval to remain. You need the future to unfold according to your script. The more tightly you bind your inner stability to external conditions, the more anxious your life becomes. Stoicism loosens that bond. It teaches you to root your dignity in character rather than circumstance. To care deeply without making your soul hostage to what you cannot command. This shift is not passive. It does not mean you stop trying, stop loving, stop building, stop hoping. It means you stop kneeling internally before outcomes. You stop saying, I can only be calm if this works, if they stay, if I win, if they approve, if life turns out according to my demand. Instead, you begin saying something much stronger. I will act fully, love honestly, prepare carefully, and give my best. But my peace will not be surrendered to what was never fully mine to command. That is the Stoic recovery of power. It is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is the end of your psychological servitude to it. Anxiety also weakens because Stoicism restores self-trust. The anxious mind constantly sends itself the same hidden message. You cannot handle what may come. That is why it obsesses. It keeps trying to solve tomorrow in advance because it does not trust your ability to meet tomorrow when it arrives. Stoicism rebuilds that trust one disciplined thought and one courageous action at a time. You endure discomfort and discover that you remain standing. You face uncertainty and discover that you remain capable. You survive awkwardness, disappointment, delay, and imperfection, and slowly the mind stops viewing every unknown as a disaster. It begins remembering that you are not as fragile as fear has suggested. This is why reclaiming your power is not about controlling life. It is about governing yourself. It is about becoming the kind of person who can meet instability without immediate collapse, who can face fear without turning fear into destiny, who can stand in uncertainty without forfeiting their mind to it. The Stoics were not promising a painless life. They were offering something more valuable, a disciplined inner life, one in which external turbulence does not automatically become internal chaos, one in which peace is built from judgment, character, and presence rather than fantasy, prediction, and control. If you apply this seriously, anxiety begins losing its authority. Not always its presence, but its authority. You notice the thought, but do not worship it. You feel the fear, but do not treat it as prophecy. You face the uncertainty, but do not surrender your dignity to it. You breathe, observe, act, and return. Again and again. This repetition matters. Because conquering anxiety is not one dramatic breakthrough. It is a gradual retraining of the mind. A repeated movement away from exaggeration and toward proportion. Away from helplessness and toward responsibility. Away from obsession and toward disciplined clarity. The anxious part of you will always want a final guarantee. It will ask, but what if things still go wrong? The Stoic answer is simple and severe. They might. And you will still meet them. That is where real power begins. Not in the promise that nothing painful will happen, but in the knowledge that whatever happens, you do not have to abandon yourself in advance. You do not have to live in chains to avoid wounds that have not yet arrived. You do not have to pay for tomorrow with a piece of today, so this is the Stoic's guide. In the end, separate what is yours from what is not. Accept reality instead of fighting it in fantasy. Question catastrophic interpretation. Face feared outcomes directly and calmly. Return to the present. Act with discipline. Observe your mind without obeying every thought. Root your value in character, not outcomes. Trust your ability to endure what life brings. These are not abstract ideals. They are the architecture of freedom. Anxiety wants to make you smaller than you are. Stoicism reminds you that your power was never supposed to come from controlling the world. It comes from governing your own response to it. It comes from standing upright inside uncertainty. It comes from refusing to let fear narrate your future before life has even spoken. And the more deeply you practice that, the more something remarkable begins to happen. The thoughts still come, but they lose force. The uncertainty still exists, but it loses its throne. The future remains unwritten, but it no longer terrifies you in the same way. Because your power is no longer scattered across imagined outcomes. It has come home to where it always belonged, your own mind. If you are done letting anxiety rule your mind, comment now, I reclaim my power.